Hi everyone, my name's Hayden and I'm here to give a lecture on CSS layouts. This lecture was prepared by Mark Gurovich at Canva and I'll just be presenting it today. So CSS layouts, just to give you a quick run through, it's really talking about how do you build boxes on pages, what do things look like, what are the different ways to lay things out, from position properties to float properties to flex properties. There's a lot to it, and to be honest with you, I think CSS layouts are very powerful when you get your head around them, but fundamentally they're always challenging. And even to this day, I don't know how many years I've been playing around with CSS and trying to build web pages with CSS. I think it's about 12 or 13 now, and to this day I still find it confusing. And I'll be Googling a lot of, it's not confusing as in, I don't know what they do, but you just like forget things sometimes. You'll be like building a page and you'll be like, that doesn't look right. Why doesn't that look right? That looks kind of weird. How do I make that box go here? And it's something that you get better and better at, but it's something that you should always, I think, approach with a sense of, it's tricky. And that's okay. And you're going to spend some time poking around and you're going to spend some time Googling, and it's not going to do what you want. It's a lot like normal programming. As you become a better programmer, it's not like you always write code that compiles every time, right? Your code will have less and less bugs in it inherently, but fundamentally, it's just sometimes something that's always hard to get perfect. So the first thing we're going to start with is what we call the box model. And the box model, really, every box element in CSS, and there's a few of them, but like think of div as your classic generic box element. It's a box that has no inherent properties, and that box element has four components. It has the actual width and height of the box itself, that's in blue. It has a padding, which is space between the element and the border. It has a border, which is usually a visual element to actually border something, and it has a margin, which is the space between the border and other elements. And what we can do here is we can make ourselves a box. I'll just call it box. Call it my box. And my box will have a width of 200 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. And we'll give it a background of blue. And let's open that page up, shall we? Yeah, you can see here's my box here. Now you notice that web pages by default actually have this this little margin around the outside of the web page. I think you can get rid of that usually by just, is it zero margin or zero padding? Yeah. So I think web pages have a default margin of some sort, and the body does, and that's to help really non-extra web pages not look weird. Because if you have no margin, pages can look pretty weird. For instance, if you didn't have this box here and you just had hey, and then you had no margin, it looks just like a little bit strange. So that's like the default state of a body tag. And this is our box here, and what we can do is if we want to add padding to it, and if you think back to the box model, padding, it's element, padding, border, margin. I might first actually add a border. The border color is going to be black or 6 zeros. The border width is going to be 3 pixels, and the border style is going to be solid, like this. So there's our box. Now there's a bunch of other styles that can be dashed as another one. I've never seen that really used in the real world much. I think there's a couple of cases I can think of. Dotted sometimes is nice. That's a little easier on the eyes. Anyway. But you can see that border's right on the edge of that div there. In fact, it's kind of inside. It's not really inside the div, but the background applies to it as well. A padding is what exists between the element and the border. So if I do a padding of 10 pixels, you'll see now that. Let me maybe flesh this out. I think I forgot a critical component here. What's happened is that the actual element and the border have a gap between them. You can't see the gap at the moment because there's nothing inside of it, right? This will make more sense. So if I had this inner box and I make this one width 100% and height 100%. Now, a width of 100% and height of 100% means that this box will essentially try and be as wide and as high as the outer box lets it. And why does this not come up? It doesn't come up because there's nothing in that box. I could add, some text to that box, hello. But let's add a background to it just so it's really clear. So now you can actually see that padding. You can see that everything inside of that my box element, i.e. which is just completely the inner box element, it's all red, and that padding is 10 pixels. If I get rid of that padding, you'll see what it looks like now. It's just the inner box and then the border. We can also add a margin, which is the space between the border and everything else, and that's where we get something like this. And this is your kind of classic box model example where you have your element, you have some padding, you have a border. That blue is really dark, so let's just do something slightly. Let's do something slightly lighter. And that border is also a bit thick. Yeah. That's probably a little bit nicer on the eyes, and that's your classic box. That's your classic box model. It's not really much to it. It's one of the most basic things I think a lot of people learn when they deal with HTML, so many of you are probably familiar with it already. And then we get into the next part, which is block elements and inline elements. These slides are very strange. So the second thing we're going to talk about is the difference between block and inline elements. So I'm going to make another file called block.html, and the key difference to understanding these is really just how they look on a page. So if I create a few divs, hello, who are you? And then I'm going to do a BR, a new line, and then I'm going to do a few spans. Hello. Actually, I might just copy these. Right? So we got some spans here. Now, take a look at these two uses of this. Remember how we've said in other lectures, divs and spans are these generic blank canvases that you can use that don't really have any properties built into them. The main difference between a div and a span is that a div is what we call a block element and a span is what we call an inline element. And the differences between those are really not that complicated. A block element always starts with a new line. It stretches to the full width of the container it's in. It can contain block and inline elements inside of it, and they're the main things. An inline element, though, essentially has the size of it like wraps really tightly around the content. It doesn't create a new line. It doesn't like break onto new lines or anything like that. It's just a little bit more. I always think about, in Microsoft Word how you're like wrap text in Microsoft Word. You know how Microsoft Word used to have these options here, where you do this. You'd have something that's like square around the, in line with the text, or it might completely create its own new lines or something. This is kind of like an inline element. It doesn't try and break the flow of the page. Whereas something that's a block element explicitly demands that there's a new line below and above it, which I don't really think, top and bottom. So I think that this here, for instance, this top and bottom is kind of really close to what a block element does, and this inline with text is a lot closer to what a span element does. And you can see this as well by let's just apply a style with a tag selector to the divs. I'll give all the divs a background of red, and I'll give all the spans a background of blue. And let's have a look at these. I think this is also most demonstrative of how it looks. You can see that each div here takes up the whole line. And you can also see if I put some other stuff here like start and finish, that each div will demand that it starts on its own line and everything after it starts on the line below it. Do you see that? Whereas if I put something here that's like start finish, then we get a different behavior. So the short story of this, I think, is that spans are used for text generally, and divs are used for boxes generally. They're kind of the two use cases. So if you're building a web page with a series of boxes, you probably use divs. If you're building a web page with a series like lots of text, or you maybe want to make a particular piece of text bold or bigger or something like that, then you'll use spans. So block elements like this. Now, I think one thing that I may have poorly communicated there is this is not that div is the block element and that spans are the inline elements. What this is saying that div has pretty much no meaningful properties except this one, display block. And span don't have many properties except display inline. These are the two properties that are baked in to div and span. And what I mean by that is let's just swap them for a second. Now this would be excessively stupid to do because it would just make no sense to anyone else programming, but that's all these elements are. Div is just a blank canvas that has the inline display that has the block display property on it, and span is just a blank canvas that has the inline display on it. That's it. So block elements are block elements. They're essentially something that has a display block CSS property on it, and inline elements are stuff that has a display inline on it. It's just that span has this by default and div has that by default. There's also the ability to display none for something. Display none just means hide it. That's really all that means. So you see when you display none something, instead of block or inline, it can be none, which means just don't show it. And then that's a great way to hide things. That's very commonly used to hide things on a website. And then you also have visibility hidden. And let's talk about the difference between these two. So let's make our spans display none, and let's make our divs divisibility hidden. Divisibility hidden. So visibility hidden changes the visibility of an element, but keeps it in the flow. Now, what do you notice about the difference between display? Like, look at the divs here for visibility hidden, and look at the divs for display none. So you can see that what display none does is it actually just doesn't really render it at all. Whereas what visibility hidden does is it kind of renders the space that it needs, but just doesn't show anything. These things aren't super useful alone. If you're just doing static CSS and HTML, it's very unlikely that you will find much of a use for display none or visibility hidden. It's much more useful when dealing with JavaScript and some dynamic web pages. So you can maybe hold that thought until you dig into that. Okay, so the meat of this lecture is probably talking about Flexbox. And in fact, we're actually going to loop back to Flexbox because I think it's a newer thing, so it might make more sense after we talk through it. Now, structuring web pages. Historically, all web pages used to be structured with tables, essentially, like a long time ago. And tables were very simple things. You had a table, you had a row in a table, and you had some cells. And then you had more rows, and then more rows. And if you wanted to build a web page, you essentially just made a web page that was a table of tables. Right, this is a table. Row 1, row 2, row 3. That was what you did. And if you wanted like a column on the left and a column over here, you'd make a thin column and then a big column, and you'd play around with tables. That's old school. We don't really talk about that much. You don't really use tables anymore when you're building web pages unless you're actually showing tabular data. As in if you're actually showing tables of results. So if you wouldn't use a table for it in Microsoft Word, you probably don't use it on a website. A common way that then came about to space things on websites was using floats. Now, we don't do this much anymore, but what floats were was if something had a float property, you removed the element from the normal flow of the page and you put it to the left or the right of the container. It's really weird, and people don't like it because it's just a little bit counterintuitive and it does break the flow. So if we have another page here called float, what we might do is we might have a very big paragraph. And I'm just going to go and get actually even better. Yeah, I'll just get a paragraph. So if you ever want a bunch of random text, a few of you might know this, you can go and just go on a Lipsum generator website and you say I want 5 paragraphs, and you can just copy and paste this stuff. It's how you get a bunch of text. It's very commonly used for building websites. Lorem ipsum text is interesting because it's text that I can't remember who did it. It's a long time ago since I learnt what this was, but essentially it looks like normal text. It's been thought out to look like normal text, as in the distribution of word lengths and how they're placed in sentences and how long sentences are. So it's a very good placeholder for what real text might look like. So if you have this on a web page, what you can do is I might add a div element. I might use some inline styles here. And inside this div element, I'm going to say I'm a box. I'm a box. And you give it a width of 50 pixels, a height of 50 pixels, border of 1 pixel. Did I screw that up? Guess I screwed that up. Where is it? It's hiding from me. What have I done? I was trying to translate it to Latin. Very curious. Does anyone see what I've done wrong? I mean, I guess you're all watching this as a recording, so I'm not sure what I've done wrong exactly. Just gonna pause it and figure it out. One sec. Okay. I stared at that for a couple minutes, and then I remembered that we've copied this example from the previous one and all divs were hidden. I'm sure some of you saw that, but that's very funny. I shouldn't have kept that CSS. So let's just include our text again. Let's get rid of those silly hidden stuff. There's our text. Now this is a normal flow of a web page. You have your block element here, and then you have your other element here. The block element, because it's a div, it's a block, it demands space above and below it. What we can do is, if we instead make this, we're going to give this a property of float left. If we give this a property of, let me just move my head. If we give this a property of float left, then what it does is it breaks the normal flow, and it essentially lets the element like float above the next element, but also at the same time not let the text get in the way. Text will wrap around it. You can also float right, which will put it on the other side of the page like this. And then also, instead of text, you can do this very weirdly with other elements. So for instance, if I want to make a div that's background is red and it's 100% of the page and 100% of the page in terms of width and height, you can see that this float here now hovers above that, like this. And then we can do some very strange things here. For instance, we could give this a width of 200 pixels, and we could give this a height of 800 pixels. Now it kind of looks like we've created a nav bar. And this was how web pages were essentially, like in the post-table era, this was how a lot of web pages were stylized. And I think there's some cases, I'm not sure if Wikipedia still use it. Maybe. I know I mean, older pages tend to. It's not a bad thing. It's just, there's limitations to what you can do without it getting very ugly. This definitely looks like a float element. This is like a classic float element here. I'm just going to quickly check, make sure I'm not full of it. But this, what I'm doing here is covered in another lecture as well. But it doesn't look like I'm going to get the information that I would like out of it. Oop, nearly there. There you go, it's a table, except it's also floating right. You see it right there? So we can make that float left if we want to. That won't do anything. Now it's floating on the other side of the page. Cool. What I've just done is part of our CSS DevTools lecture. If you haven't seen that, go check it out. It'll be cool. It is cool, sorry. Cool. So that's what floats are used for. Now, you'll see this around a lot on the internet. Generally, you only want to use it in situations where you are legitimately wanting something to just float, hang off the side, like that Wikipedia example. you tend not to want to use it in situations where you're actually trying to structure web pages. While Flexbox is probably something that you're more likely to use to structure web pages, something that has been a big part of web pages for a long time is the position property of elements. There are 4 position properties that we're going to go through: static, relative, absolute, and fixed. Static is kind of the easiest to understand because it's the default property of something. So I'm just going to pause and get this example up. Here for you to look at. So here you can see that we've got a very simple page which has a container div component, which inside of it has a span position component of class type span. Now the container, here's the thing about position. Every single element in CSS has a default position property of static, which essentially means it's like the position thing isn't really playing a part in it. Besides static, the other types that we have are, we have static, we have relative, we have absolute, and we have fixed. So static's kind of static is like saying there is no position stuff happening here. But the relative position is saying that something is happening here. If something is relative, what it's saying is that the element is positioned offset to its default position. So whenever something is position relative, position absolute, or position fixed, the way it's positioned is through an offset. And that offset is written here on lines 13 and 14. And it's essentially a way of saying, how many pixels am I from the left, or the top, or the right, or the bottom? So you can define the offset with respect to the top, left, right, or bottom. You can't do that for statically positioned things, because remember, static means that we're not using the position properties. That's why in a case like this, my position class is has a position of static, and therefore nothing really happens. But if I use a position of relative here, which you can see relative makes the offset applied based on its own position, you notice that element moves. So that's what a relative position does. It says, like, where would I normally be in my element, and then I will position relative to that. If this is static, nothing happens. So top, left, right, and bottom are ignored for static elements. So if this is position relative, you'll also notice instead of top and left, I can do bottom and right. That means that where it normally is, we're going to align 20 pixels from the bottom and 20 pixels from the right. And you notice where that's positioned now. So it's really quite straightforward. You find the normal position of it and you offset it. That's all positions are dealing with, is just offsets. So relative's quite straightforward. The trickier one is probably absolute. And the way absolute works is that the offset is positioned from the parent, from the nearest parent. Like if you're an element and you start bubbling up through parents, it positions itself as an offset relative to the first non-static parent that it can find. So what I mean by that is if you look at this container here, let's make this container's relative at the moment, right? And if we make our position class, I'm actually just going to call this, let's just call this item class because I'm sick of saying position. If we look at our item class and we make this absolute instead of relative, what you'll notice is that everything goes funny. And the reason it goes funny in this case is because what we're saying is that this item class is positioned offset relative to the nearest non-static parent. The container here is a position relative container. It's not static. And what might be hard to see in this particular example is that this red text here is actually 20 pixels from the top of and 20 pixels from the left. And the top and the left of this container element is not where the text starts, it's actually where the border is. So if I was to change these two to 5 pixels, for instance, now you'll see where that red text ends up. So again, red text item, position absolute means it positions itself offset to the top left of the container, which is up around here. If I was to change this to 0 pixels, we would end up tucked right up the top. And if I was to use right and bottom here instead, saying I want my element to be positioned 0 offset from the right and 0 from the bottom, we would end up with that. Notice the difference again between position absolute here and position relative. Position relative offsets it within its original component. Relative is really easy to understand because it behaves like the HTML and CSS you're used to. You're just offsetting within that element, like with respect to where that element would normally be. Absolute's the tricky one. And to give you an example of how absolute can also be confusing, let's imagine that we give this a, left of 10 pixels, or left of 30, left of 20 pixels. I'll go 10. And we'll go top of 10 pixels. Have a look again where this ends up. It's 10 pixels from the top of the blue box and 10 pixels from the left of the blue box. The reason it's offset to the blue box is because that is the nearest parent that is non-static. Watch what happens when I make the container static. Now, because the container's static, as the browser tries to make sense of what this is positioned absolute with respect to, it looks up, the container is static, it looks up and it ends up at the body. And since the body's the last element, it's like, well, I have to position relative to that. That's why the red text here is offset to the body now, not to the blue container. That's why quite often if you go on the internet, you'll see a lot of cases where to make an element position absolute, you need to make one of its parents position relative to look okay on the page. Position absolute's probably very useful for doing things like making little X's. So that's something if you have a pop-up box or something and you'd like to add a close button in, which is just an X, then you might do something like end close position absolute, top 5 pixels, right 5 pixels, and now you'll have an X up in the top right. And you can tweak these numbers until you get what you want. There. That X looks a bit funny, so we use font family Arial, and now you have a big X, and I don't like that, so we can make it even smaller. Font size 10 pt, and still smaller. Now we're starting to get somewhere I'd like to. While we're here, I'll just quickly show you as well. This is a good case of where you'd actually add a hover element. So in the case of our close property, when you hover it, I actually want the cursor to change. So the cursor is this little, I can't point to it, but it's where I'm moving my mouse, right? So I'd really like it when I hover over the X for it to be something that makes it look like it's clickable. You'll see if you notice the mouse change here as I move my mouse over it. That's kind of one of those signals that you probably don't realize you use when you interact with websites that teaches you that you're actually able to click on something. So that's position absolute. Understanding position absolute and position relative is really important, that distinction. I think position relative is easy, position absolute is okay once you get your head around it. And the fourth one is fixed position. Fixed position, ironically, I think is probably easier than them all because it doesn't need any of this parent that's non-static or whatever. If something is position fixed, it's simply relative to the viewport or the window. So if we've got a page like this, and I'll just get rid of some of this here. If I create a box, I'll call it my box, and inside my box, the properties of my box will just be width 50 pixels, height 50 pixels, and a background blue. Okay, it's just a box. It's not very complicated. I'm going to put a whole bunch of text on this page now. I'm going to go and grab our lorem ipsum text, and I'm going to add it to a p tag. I might add it twice, just so we have a lot of it. I'm also going to add just, if we display this page as it is, what you'll notice is it all comes out in one big clump. That's again because browsers don't care about white space, and we haven't used the paragraph tag here appropriately. So I'm just going to add a paragraph tag to all of these rogue paragraphs that are floating around on the page. So now you see we've got our paragraphs. Now here's the thing to understand about position fixed. Your page might be this long, something like this, and your web browser typically has a window that's only like this. And the act of scrolling is essentially you moving your window across the document. So when we make something fixed, what we're doing is we're fixing it to the viewport or the window, such that if we put it up in the top left, it doesn't matter where we scroll to on the page, we are still holding it in the same position. So you notice when I scroll this page up and down, this blue box stays where it is. If I was to make this blue box position absolute and make it bottom 20 pixel, right 20 pixel, as in tuck it down the bottom right, have a look where it ends up. It ends up down here. Kind of at the bottom of the document as it is. You'll notice that it's a bit weird this case, but you'll notice that it's fixed on the document, right? Even though we've controlled its position, as the viewport moves, or the window, our window into the page moves, the blue box is still static. So if we make this fixed instead, it gets stuck to the actual viewport. Notice how when we scroll the page, this stays fixed. Fixed essentially, it means it hovers above the document is one way to think about it. A very common usage of this is chatbots. So if you're on a website and there's a little chatbot that's asking you, do you need any help, or talking to someone, usually that's fixed. Another simple use case would be headers. Lots of websites use headers that float down. I was thinking of one. I'm just Googling random airlines. Not this one. Not my UNSW. No doubt there are plenty. I just haven't thought of one right now, but we've all seen 100 of them. I guess YouTube. YouTube does it a bit. YouTube has a fixed header bar and a fixed sidebar. See that, how it's like attached to the viewport and not to the document, so it kind of floats above. It's Kevin Rudd. Kind of floats above the document itself. Generally, it is possible to build pages with this. It's challenging though, I think, in some ways, because generally you use a lot of position stuff when you are trying to get things to float around on the page with quite a lot of precision. And I guess just the last thing on this would be overflow. So this is probably actually quite relevant for our lorem ipsum text while we're here. I'm going to wrap all of my lorem ipsum text in a div. I'll call it ipsum text. I'll wrap it all in a div, and then I'll give this this div class a property, some CSS properties. I'll give it a width of 700 pixels and a height of 400 pixels. Now you notice not much changed here. It doesn't look like a change, but let me show you why. If I make the background something quite bright like red, you'll notice here that this is the div, and the text is fitted. It's fitted within it. If I make this smaller, you notice the text fits within it. But what we have in this case is something called overflow, which is where the inner elements can't fit inside the outer element, and therefore the default behavior is to overflow. If we want to control this, then we can control it with the overflow property, and there's essentially the two main ones that you would deal with are hidden or scroll. So default is visible. By default, things are allowed to overflow. But if we don't want them to overflow, then we can hide them. And when you put hidden on a class, it hides all of the inner HTML that overflows. Oh, sorry, visibility. I meant overflow. My bad. Disappeared. So you see here how it just gets cut off. The other one is that you can do overflow as scroll. And if you do overflow scroll, it will add in scroll bars if you need it. That's a very common way to deal with overflow. And the browser handles this for you, right? It just puts in the normal scroll bars. So yeah, that's the crux of overflow and position. The one thing we haven't covered is Flexbox, which that'll be in a separate lecture if you haven't seen it already. But just to recap again, we've talked about the box model to understand the box model, talked about block elements and inline elements, and we've talked about positions, static, relative, absolute, fixed. And you can get a lot done with web pages with just this understanding of layouts. And when you combine that with knowledge of Flexbox, things become even easier.